Okay, hi everybody. We're also going to pick up from where we just left off. Another thing happening during this time, the contemporary era, is you see older like colonial boundaries going away and getting redrawn, and new like the populations of people getting like resettled and displaced and having to move around. So one example of population resettlements and like forced like resettlement of people is the partition of India. Remember, the Muslims go to Pakistan, um, Hindus migrate south so that all of them are in India. There's also the like after World War II, the creation of the state of Israel for Jewish people, which displaced or forced Palestinian Arabs to move out of their homeland. Remember, Israel is actually right in the middle of Arab territory. It was created by the victors of World War II as a place for Jewish people, which was significant because the Holocaust had just occurred. So those are two examples of like displacement and redrawing of old colonial boundaries that made people move and resettle. There's also also something that happened is interesting is that once colonialism was over or once imperialism was over, some people who lived in like the colonies of the European countries like moved to the European country. So, for example, people who remember how France had imperialized Algeria in Africa. Well, people from Algeria, after they were free from French rule, some of them moved to France, usually to major cities in France or in that example, Paris and places like that. But mostly when they returned to the mother country, it was when they returned to that European mother country that had colonized them for a long time, it was to the cities where they'd live. Um, there's also other like examples of ethnic violence. You know, the Holocaust, obviously, but also don't forget the genocide of Armenians in Turkey, like right before and during World War I, the Armenian genocide. Also, there's the Rwandan conflict in the 1990s. Some of you may have heard of that. It's the Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda. Okay, so that's another concept. Another one, we're going to talk world wars real quick. You know, World War I and World War II were total wars, right? That meant that all all facets of society were involved in those wars, from men who were drafted to fight, women on the home front who had to fill the jobs men left, to factories being taken over by governments and governments kind of saying, hey, we need your factory to produce bullets or rations or other kind of weapons or supplies for the armed forces fighting in the war. It also means there's a limited number of people and weapons involved. So very destructive wars, and civilian populations get hurt in these world wars. Governments use different ideologies to get people going and supporting the war effort. So some new ideologies that arise through these wars is fascism, communism. Don't forget the idea of nationalism. Governments really use that, especially to trump up the war cause and get people all nationalistic through like propaganda, speeches, and things like that to really get people behind their cause of the wars, specifically the world wars. The world wars are, again, unprecedented in that they're a global scale. The global wars, literally, the whole world was fighting with each other, right? In the first World War, there's many causes, right? There's imperialism, industrialization, competition, assassination of the Archduke, things like that, right? There's very much still empire going on. The World War I is unique in that there's also the system of alliances. Remember the Triple Alliance, Triple Entente are the major alliances. Major alliances in that time frame. After World War I, remember Japan rises to power. However, they're left out of the League of Nations through that racist ideology of the Western powers. So they kind of become anti-Western, but Japan also does rise to authority after World War I. A little bit more on World War II. The world balance of power shifts greatly after World War II. So you remember bombing of Pearl Harbor, that's what gets the United States involved, but the growing aggression of Hitler, Nazi Party in Germany, the annexation of Austria, of Czechoslovakia, and finally the invasion of Poland, plus the policy of appeasement allows Hitler to really gain power and violate pretty much every limitation put on him by the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, the Treaty of Versailles was signed after World War I to punish Germany harshly for the war, or for the causing World War I. It put Germany in a bad situation. It took away Germany's military, made them pay reparations, which was very is difficult for Germany. So their unemployment went way up, and when the global depression comes, Germany suffers even more. However, with Hitler's rise, Germany regains power, and Hitler, who was still bitter about World War I, takes over the government, and the Nazi Party becomes the dominant party in German politics, and eventually they become very aggressive and start World War II with the invasion of Poland. So the outcome of World War II, obviously, though, Hitler is defeated, and the Russians, the British, the Allies, the Americans all are the victors. What the outcome is there is that the world is kind of divided and evolved into the Cold War, which is that rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that is an ideological war with capitalism and communism. A lot of the world kind of sides with either Soviets or the United States, but that's a result for World War II that is a new, like, no longer is it like Hitler in Europe and Japan and fascist rulers leading. It becomes the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, kind of competing against each other. Cold War, remember, produces new military alliances, two of which are NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That is the United States western side of it. And then there's the Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviet eastern side of the Cold War. Those are the military alliances. Remember, there's also proxy wars that happened during the Cold War with the Vietnam, Korea, and the Afghanistan-Soviet conflict. There's also something called non-alignment. So not everyone in the world either sides with the United States or the Soviet Union in the Cold War. There's something called non-alignment, where people just kind of refuse to, or groups, countries decide, I'm not going to join either side, right? They oppose going to socialism or capitalism, fully supporting the U.S. or the Soviets. So just some examples of that are all the Pan movements, the Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism, anti-apartheid movements, protesters in China who kind of don't want to, they don't want communism in China. So, there's also, remember in China's interesting, I just kind of thought of this. Remember China, the Qing dynasty falls in 1914, and that sends China into a tailspin right during World War I. And China goes through lots of civil war and revolution, and then China ultimately it goes through a lot of civil war between the Chinese communist and nationalist groups. Nationalists are supported by the United States because they don't want communism spreading to China, but ultimately through Mao Zedong's leadership, Chinese communism is adopted. Remember, his version of communism is very much peasant-oriented, which is different from the Chinese or the Russian version of communism, which is very industrial worker factory system oriented. So that pretty much concludes the global conflict piece of this, but pretty much everything you see on the screen, plus a few more details on the Cold War and China and communism and the global depression, are what you would need to study. But that's the kind of one of the big stories of the 20th century. I'm going to talk more about in the next videos new economic changes, during the contemporary era. But for now, just kind of listen to this and try to review this slides for a few seconds.